On February 9th, 2027, at 14:37 hours Universal Time, NASA astronaut Tyler Brennan, 39 years old, a decorated Navy test pilot with 12 years at the agency and 340 accumulated days in space across 2 previous missions, stood inside the Artemis III lunar module at Shackleton Crater's western rim and watched something that should not exist walk across the surface of the Moon. The mission parameters were straightforward. Artemis III, humanity's first crewed landing at the lunar South Pole, had touched down 72 hours earlier with a crew of 3. Commander Rachel Ortiz, mission specialist Kara Voss, and Tyler as lunar module pilot. Their objective was a 6-day surface operation to establish preliminary infrastructure for the planned Artemis Base Camp, scheduled for construction in 2029. The landing site, designated Shackleton West Alpha, offered permanent access to both sunlight for solar power and adjacent permanently shadowed regions containing water ice deposits worth their weight in liquid oxygen and rocket fuel. It was, by every metric, the most strategically valuable piece of real estate beyond Earth. Tyler had been conducting a routine geological survey through the module's observation window, cataloging surface features for the mission log, when movement in his peripheral vision made him stop. At first, he assumed it was the autonomous rover they'd deployed that morning, a 4-wheeled instrument platform programmed to collect regolith samples from a crater 2.3 kilometers due south. But the rover's telemetry showed it stationary, its sampling drill extracting core material from beneath the lunar dust. Whatever Tyler was looking at, it wasn't their equipment. He activated the window-mounted high-definition camera system, a 4,000-pixel resolution unit designed for geological documentation, and zoomed to maximum magnification. The figure came into focus with a clarity that made his trained pilot's brain reject what his eyes were reporting. Bipedal. Approximately 1.8 meters tall. Moving with a distinctive gait pattern, heel strike to toe off, cadence measured and purposeful. The camera's timestamp began recording, 14:37 and 42 seconds UTC. Tyler's hand reached for the communications panel, but something made him hesitate, made him watch for 3 more seconds before calling it in. The figure was not wearing a spacesuit. At least, not any spacesuit Tyler recognized from 12 years of NASA briefings. Not the bulky white exploration extravehicular mobility units his crew wore for surface operations. Not the sleeker designs under development by commercial partners. Not even the experimental concepts he'd seen in classified presentations. The form appeared almost unprotected. And it was walking, not with the cautious bunny-hop motion that lunar gravity and bulky suits demanded, but with smooth, adapted strides that suggested comfort, familiarity, like someone who'd done this before, many times before. Tyler's voice was controlled when he finally spoke into the comm. Houston, Artemis III LM. I have visual confirmation of an anomalous object. Correction. Anomalous figure. Bearing 180 degrees relative. Distance approximately 2.3 kilometers. Humanoid profile. Repeat. Humanoid profile. The response from Mission Control took the standard 2.6 seconds for radio transmission to cross the 384,000 kilometers between worlds. Copy that, Artemis III. Can you clarify humanoid profile? Stand by. Tyler's fingers moved across the camera controls, fine-tuning the focus, increasing the digital stabilization. Rachel and Kara were in the habitat module 50 meters away, conducting systems checks. He didn't call them yet. He needed to be sure. Needed those extra seconds of observation before turning this into something that would trigger protocols and procedures, and questions he couldn't answer. The figure stopped walking. For 11 seconds, it stood motionless on the crater floor, and Tyler felt a sensation he'd never experienced in all his years of flight training. All those hours in experimental aircraft pushing Mach 3 at 70,000 feet. All those days in orbit, watching Earth turn beneath him. It was the sensation of being observed. The figure appeared to orient toward the landing site, toward him, and Tyler understood with absolute certainty that whatever he was looking at, it knew he was there. Then it turned and walked back the way it had come, disappearing behind a 40-meter elevation ridge in the crater wall. The camera kept recording. 4 minutes and 18 seconds of footage. 4 minutes and 18 seconds of something impossible. Because the surface temperature at Shackleton Crater's sunlit areas measured negative 183 degrees Celsius. Exposure to lunar vacuum meant death in 15 seconds as fluids boiled from lung tissue and blood. Direct solar radiation without protection delivered a lethal dose in under 2 minutes. The figure Tyler watched had moved for 4 minutes and 18 seconds, and then the camera feed went dark, every external sensor on the lunar module failing simultaneously with a precision that no random malfunction could explain. Houston's voice came back, different now, urgent but controlled. Artemis 3, we're showing complete loss of external telemetry. Initiate immediate communications blackout and await further instructions. Acknowledge. Tyler acknowledged. He sat in the observation station as his hands began to shake. Delayed response, adrenaline catching up to cognition. Through the window, the lunar surface stretched empty and still, gray regolith and black shadow, exactly as it had been for 4.5 billion years. Except now, Tyler knew it wasn't empty. Had never been empty. And somewhere in the permanently shadowed regions beyond his line of sight, something that should not survive was surviving, walking, watching. The mission would be terminated in 38 hours. All 3 crew members would sign non-disclosure agreements before leaving quarantine. And 3 years later, when Tyler's personal audio diary was leaked to investigative journalist Marcus Webb and verified by independent forensics labs, the world would hear Rachel's voice from that first moment after Tyler called her to the observation window. "Tyler, you seeing what I'm seeing?" And his response, barely a whisper. "Yeah, and it sees us, too." The footage that Tyler Brennan's camera captured before the blackout would remain classified under National Security Space Activities Protocols for 33 months, the same designation typically reserved for reconnaissance satellite programs and nuclear weapons verification systems, until aerospace engineer Marcus Delacroix, 41 years old, a 14-year veteran of NASA's Johnson Space Center Image Analysis Division, received an encrypted file transfer from an anonymous source in TDD August 2029 and began the most meticulous examination of his career. The Artemis 3 lunar module had been equipped with what NASA called the Advanced Surface Documentation System, a camera array consisting of 3 4,000-pixel resolution units mounted on motorized gimbals, each capable of 200 times optical zoom and equipped with image stabilization algorithms designed to compensate for the subtle vibrations caused by crew movement inside the pressurized habitat. The system captured at 30 frames per second with full-color spectrum recording, though color on the Moon meant distinguishing between shades of gray and brown, the regolith's iron oxide content giving some areas a rust-tinted appearance under direct sunlight. The cameras were designed to document geological features for scientific analysis, to record equipment deployment procedures for engineering review, to create a visual archive of humanity's return to the lunar surface, after a 55-year absence. They were not designed to document something that violated every principle of human survival in vacuum environments. Marcus isolated the relevant segment from the mission's continuous recording stream, 258 seconds, beginning at 14:37 hours and 42 seconds UTC, and terminating at 14:41 hours and 40 seconds UTC, when all three external cameras simultaneously ceased transmission. He divided the footage into 7,740 individual frames and began his analysis with the systematic methodology that had made him one of the most respected image analysts in the agency. The kind of attention to detail that had previously identified microfractures in heat shield tiles and detected anomalous ice crystal formations on comet surfaces light-years from Earth. Frames 1 through 89 showed the figure's emergence from behind a ridge formation approximately 2.3 kilometers south of the landing site. The ridge itself was a crater wall remnant, 40 meters high according to pre-mission LiDAR mapping, casting a shadow that extended roughly 120 meters across the crater floor, depending on the sun's angle, which at that latitude varied only between 5 and 7 degrees above the horizon. The figure appeared at frame 89, emerging from shadow into direct sunlight with no visible transition period, no gradual revelation of form, as someone walking from darkness into light would naturally produce. One frame showed empty terrain, the next frame showed the figure fully present, as though materialization rather than locomotion had brought it into view. Marcus ran the sequence through motion analysis software originally developed for studying astronaut gait patterns during extravehicular activities, algorithms that measured stride length, cadence, center of gravity displacement, and joint articulation to assess spacesuit performance and identify potential mobility issues before they became safety hazards. The software tagged the figure's movement pattern as consistent with bipedal human locomotion, adapted for reduced gravity environments. Stride length averaged approximately 1.4 meters, each step taking roughly 1.3 seconds, producing a cadence of 46 steps per minute. Normal human walking cadence on Earth ranged from 100 to 120 steps per minute, but lunar gravity, 1/6 that of Earth, naturally extended stride duration and length. The mathematics aligned perfectly with what a human walking on the moon should look like, which made the absence of other expected characteristics profoundly disturbing. Frames 90 through 156 captured the figure's approach across open terrain, and Marcus focused his analysis on a phenomenon that every lunar surface operation since Apollo 11 had demonstrated with absolute consistency: dust displacement. The lunar regolith, pulverized by 4.5 billion years of meteorite impacts in the absence of atmospheric weathering, possessed the consistency of talcum powder mixed with ground glass, particles ranging from sub-micron to several millimeters in diameter. Any disturbance, any contact, any movement across the surface launched clouds of this material in ballistic arcs, particles following perfect parabolic trajectories in the absence of air resistance, traveling significant distances before settling back to the surface, under the moon's weak gravitational pull. Every Apollo astronaut's footsteps had kicked up visible plumes. Every rover's wheels had created rooster tails of regolith. Every equipment deployment had generated dust clouds that took minutes to fully dissipate. The figure in Tyler's footage walked across 67 consecutive frames, covering approximately 94 meters of surface terrain, and displaced no visible dust. Not a single particle rose from its footfalls. The regolith appeared completely undisturbed by its passage, as though the figure moved without making physical contact with the ground, hovering at precisely surface level while maintaining the biomechanical appearance of walking. Marcus ran spectral analysis on the surface area beneath the figure's apparent footfalls, looking for any variation in light reflection that might indicate compression or disturbance too subtle for visual detection. The analysis showed no measurable change. Whatever was moving across that crater floor was either so light that it failed to disturb dust particles measuring microns in diameter, or it was interacting with the surface through principles that Marcus's 3 degrees in aerospace engineering had never encountered. Frames 157 through 203 documented the camera's automatic zoom activation, a feature triggered when the system's artificial intelligence detected objects of interest that warranted closer examination. The zoom was smooth, professional-grade optical magnification that brought the figure to center frame and increased its apparent size by a factor of 3.8. At maximum magnification, details became visible that Tyler's naked eye observation through the module window could never have perceived. The figure's form suggested humanoid proportions, bilateral symmetry, clearly defined head and torso and limbs, but the surface texture appeared wrong in ways that Marcus struggled to articulate in his technical notes. It wasn't smooth, like a modern spacesuit's outer thermal layer, wasn't textured like woven fabric, wasn't segmented like the hard-shell joint assemblies that allowed suited astronauts to maintain mobility. It appeared almost translucent in certain frames, as though the harsh lunar sunlight passed partially through rather than reflecting off the surface, creating an effect that resembled frosted glass more than any material designed for space environments. And then, frames 204 through 216, the figure stopped. 11 seconds of absolute stillness in the middle of open terrain. No visible purpose for the pause. No equipment interaction. No sample collection. Just cessation of movement. Marcus enhanced the frames, adjusted contrast and brightness, applied every filtering technique the agency had developed for extracting maximum information from astronomical imagery. The figure's orientation shifted slightly during those 11 seconds, a subtle rotation that suggested it was turning toward the Artemis 3 landing site, toward the lunar module, toward Tyler Brennan and his camera. There were no visible facial features Marcus could distinguish, no eyes or sensor array he could identify, but the posture conveyed observation, the same body language a person displays when they notice something unexpected and pause to assess. Frames 217 through 258 showed the figure's departure, the same smooth gait carrying it back across the crater floor, back toward the ridge, back into shadow. It disappeared at frame 256 with the same abrupt transition that had marked its emergence, present in one frame and absent in the next, and then, 2 seconds later, every camera on the Artemis 3 lunar module experienced simultaneous catastrophic failure, the kind of synchronized malfunction that random chance could not explain, and that equipment redundancy was specifically designed to prevent. Marcus completed his analysis and encrypted his findings, confirmed visual documentation of an entity demonstrating human-scale bipedal locomotion on the lunar surface without apparent environmental protection, without dust displacement consistent with physical contact, and with optical properties inconsistent with known materials. His report included a single recommendation: immediate classification review to determine whether the footage represented unknown technology, unknown natural phenomenon, or something the classification system had no category to contain. The recommendation was denied. The footage was moved to a restricted access server. And Marcus Delacroix, like Tyler Brennan before him, was offered early retirement with full benefits and a non-disclosure agreement that threatened federal prosecution for violations. He signed it. But he also made a copy of those 258 seconds, stored on an encrypted drive that 3 years later would find its way to investigative journalist Marcus Webb. The the same man who had verified Tyler's leaked audio diary, the same man building a pattern from fragments that official channels insisted didn't exist. The copy Marcus Delacroix made of those 258 seconds would eventually reach investigative journalist Marcus Webb, not as an isolated anomaly, but as the most recent data point in a pattern that stretched back 55 years to the final days of the Apollo program, when humanity last walked on lunar soil and witnessed things that never made it into the official mission transcripts, things that were edited from public recordings, things that were discussed only in classified debriefings with military intelligence officers who asked very specific questions about what the astronauts had seen in the permanently shadowed regions where sunlight never reached and Earth never rose above the horizon. December 14th, 1972, 1954 hours and 38 seconds, Universal Time. Apollo 17, the last crewed lunar mission in human history until Artemis III's landing 55 years later, had astronauts Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt conducting geological surveys in the Taurus-Littrow Valley when Mission Control in Houston received 23 seconds of transmission that was subsequently deleted from the official NASA archives, audio that remained classified until a Freedom of Information Act request filed by Dr. Sarah Chen, a researcher at MIT's Taipei. Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics forced its release in 2019. The audio quality was poor, degraded by 5 decades of magnetic tape storage and multiple generation copying. But Cernan's voice was unmistakable, calm, but with an undertone that 12 years of military aviation and 3 previous space flights had trained him to suppress. Houston, we're observing multiple light sources, distinct from the lunar module, approximately 2 kilometers south-southeast. They appear to be in motion. Repeat, in motion. Advise. The transmission cut for 3.2 seconds with what NASA claimed was solar interference, but solar activity records from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration showed no significant events during that time window. And when the audio resumed, Cernan's voice had changed, had become controlled and precise and emptied of the curiosity that had marked his initial report. Houston, disregard previous. We're observing reflections from discarded equipment, proceeding with extravehicular activity 3 as planned. The mission report documented no equipment discarded in that direction. The area south-southeast of Taurus-Littrow was pristine lunar surface untouched by previous missions, and Harrison Schmitt, a professional geologist and the only scientist to walk on the moon, was asked about this transmission during an interview in 2021. His response was carefully worded, each sentence appearing to provide information while revealing nothing substantial. Some observations made during Apollo surface operations remain under evaluation. The lunar environment presents optical phenomena that we're still working to understand, and our knowledge of the moon's history, of what may have occurred there over geological timescales, continues to evolve. The interviewer pressed for clarification, asked directly about the light sources Cernan had reported, and Schmitt terminated the interview, stood up, removed his microphone, and left without another word. Apollo 15, August 2nd, 1971. Commander David Scott and lunar module pilot James Irwin spent 3 days exploring the Hadley-Apennine region, and their classified post-flight debriefing, portions of which were leaked to aerospace journalist Thomas Rodriguez in 2018, included references to what Scott described as vertical movement inconsistent with known surface features observed near Hadley-Ryle, a channel cut into the lunar surface by ancient lava flows, now a winding canyon 1.5 kilometers wide and 400 meters deep in places. The movement occurred in shadow, in areas where the sun's low angle created permanent darkness at the bottom of the rill. And Scott's description matched no geological process, no equipment malfunction, no optical illusion that the debriefing officers could reasonably explain. The incident was noted in the classified record and never mentioned in public documentation. And David Scott, when asked about it 47 years later during a documentary interview, stated simply that some observations from Apollo remain subject to national security review, and he was not authorized to discuss them, a remarkable statement given that the Cold War had ended 30 years prior and the Soviet Union no longer existed to compete against. Further back, deeper into the historical pattern, to 1966, when the Soviet Union's Lunar 13 probe made a soft landing on the Moon's Oceanus Procellarum region and transmitted data for 75 hours before contact was lost. The official Soviet Space Agency statement attributed the loss to battery depletion, a reasonable explanation given the probe's limited power supply, but documents obtained after the Soviet Union's collapse showed that the final telemetry transmission included visual data that engineers described in technical reports as anomalous vertical profile inconsistent with expected surface topography, a bureaucratic way of saying the cameras had captured something that shouldn't be there, something that stood up when everything on the Moon should lie flat. The images were never released. The relevant pages in the engineering reports were stamped classified, even after the agency itself ceased to exist, and the 3 engineers who had analyzed the data were quietly reassigned to terrestrial satellite programs and forbidden from discussing lunar projects for the remainder of their careers. 3 incidents across 5 decades, different missions, different agencies, different technologies, but the same fundamental pattern: observation of movement in shadowed regions, immediate institutional response, systematic suppression of information, and severe consequences for anyone who spoke about what they'd seen. Tyler Brennan and his crew were confined to the Artemis 3 lunar module for 14 hours following Tyler's sighting, told that ground control was conducting systems verification to ensure the environmental failures that had knocked out the cameras hadn't compromised other critical equipment. The telemetry data that was later leaked showed every system operating at optimal parameters, no anomalies, no degradation, no technical justification for keeping 3 astronauts locked in a space the size of a small bedroom while something walked outside in an environment that should kill any living thing in seconds. Mission Director Derek Castellano ordered abort procedures 38 hours into what was planned as a 6-day surface operation, citing a malfunction in the life support system's carbon dioxide scrubbing capability that posed unacceptable risk to crew safety. The Artemis 3 crew returned to the Orion spacecraft in lunar orbit, conducted the trans-Earth injection burn, and spent 4 days in quarantine after splashdown, while NASA medical teams conducted examinations that found nothing wrong with any of them. No radiation exposure beyond expected levels, no physiological changes, no evidence of stress or trauma. Just 3 astronauts who had seen something they couldn't explain and who were now being very carefully isolated from anyone who might ask them to try. The non-disclosure agreements were comprehensive, 17 pages of legal language that made clear any discussion of classified mission elements would constitute breach of federal national security statutes, punishable by imprisonment and forfeiture of all NASA pension benefits, a particularly effective threat for career astronauts who had spent decades building toward retirement. Tyler signed. Rachel Ortiz signed. Kara Voss signed. And for 18 months they maintained the silence their government required of them, appeared at official NASA events, gave carefully scripted interviews about the Artemis program's success and humanity's future on the Moon, smiled for photographs while carrying knowledge that made those smiles feel like participation in something fundamentally dishonest. Kara Voss broke first. During an unauthorized interview with independent media journalist Patricia Morgan in September 2029, conducted in a coffee shop in Houston with no NASA public affairs officers present, Kara was asked a simple question about what she remembered most from the lunar surface, and instead of delivering the approved response about the beauty of Earth rising above the crater rim, she said 6 words that would end her astronaut career 72 hours later. It wasn't equipment. It was alive. Patricia asked for elaboration, and Kara continued, speaking quickly as though she understood this might be her only opportunity. It moved with purpose. It knew the terrain. And when it stopped and oriented toward our position, I felt observed. Not by equipment, not by some automated probe, by something aware, something that recognized we were there and decided we were worth paying attention to. The interview was published online, viewed 47,000 times in the first 6 hours, and Kara Voss received notice of contract termination before the day ended, NASA citing personal reasons incompatible with continued service. The same vague justification that had been used to quietly remove dozens of astronauts, engineers, and scientists over the decades. Anyone who saw too much and talked too freely and threatened the carefully maintained narrative that humanity's ventures into. Space had encountered nothing we couldn't explain. Kara's final statement before disappearing from public life was delivered through Patricia Morgan. The moon isn't empty. It never was. And whatever is there knows we've finally come back. Baudi, the footage that Marcus Delacroix had encrypted and preserved, the 258 seconds that captured something impossible walking on lunar soil, reached Dr. Jennifer Ashford at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory 6 months after Kara Voss's career-ending interview, and Jennifer, a specialist in machine learning applications for astronomical image enhancement who had previously worked on reconstructing damaged data. From the Hubble Space Telescope and analyzing surface features on distant exoplanets, approached the footage with the same rigorous methodology she applied to all problems that seemed to defy conventional explanation. Assume nothing, verify everything, let the data speak regardless of how uncomfortable its implications might be. Jennifer's laboratory had developed neural network algorithms capable of reconstructing corrupted or low-resolution imagery by training on vast datasets of similar visual information, essentially teaching artificial intelligence to fill gaps and enhance details based on statistical probability and pattern recognition, techniques that had revealed atmospheric composition on planets dozens of light-years distant and identified geological features on asteroids from fragmentary probe data. She applied these tools to Tyler Brennan's footage, focusing specifically on the frames where automatic zoom had brought the figure to maximum magnification. Frames 157 through 203, 47 seconds of the clearest visual documentation humanity possessed of something that shouldn't exist. The algorithm processed for 11 hours on MIT's high-performance computing cluster, analyzing pixel patterns, enhancing edge definition, reconstructing details that optical limitations and atmospheric interference, or in the moon's case, the complete absence of atmosphere, had rendered ambiguous or invisible to direct observation. The results appeared on Jennifer's monitor at 3:27 in the morning, and she spent the next 40 minutes reviewing the enhanced imagery before calling Dr. Robert Chen, her colleague who specialized in extremophile biology, and the theoretical limits of life in hostile environments, because what the reconstruction showed required expertise she didn't possess, and implications she couldn't evaluate alone. The figure wasn't just walking across the lunar surface, it was carrying something, an object approximately 60 centimeters in length, held in what the enhancement suggested was a right-side appendage, grip posture consistent with how a human hand would hold a cylindrical tool or instrument. The object's surface texture, revealed through the AI's probabilistic reconstruction of degraded pixels, appeared translucent. Not the solid opacity of metal or composite materials, but something that allowed partial light transmission, creating internal refraction patterns that suggested either advanced manufacturing techniques or material properties that Robert's 3 decades studying extremophile organisms in Earth's most hostile environments, from Antarctic subglacial lakes to deep sea. Hydrothermal vents had never encountered in biological structures. Robert arrived at the laboratory at 6:15, reviewed Jennifer's analysis, and provided context that made the impossibility more profound. Extremophile organisms on Earth, the tardigrades and thermophiles and halophiles that survived conditions once thought incompatible with life, achieved their resilience through specific adaptations. Tardigrades entered cryptobiosis, a state of suspended animation where metabolic activity essentially ceased, allowing survival in vacuum but not movement or active function. Thermophiles thrived in superheated water near volcanic vents, but required liquid water, pressure, and specific chemical conditions. No known organism on Earth could maintain active biological processes in the combined assault of hard vacuum, extreme temperature fluctuation from -183 Celsius in shadow to +127 Celsius in direct sunlight, and ionizing radiation levels that would shred DNA faster than cellular repair mechanisms could compensate. The figure Tyler Brennan observed walked for 4 minutes and 18 seconds in conditions that should have killed any Earth-based life form in under 20 seconds, and if it wasn't Earth-based life, if it represented something that had evolved under different conditions with different biochemistry, then the question became not whether life existed beyond Earth, but whether it had been on the Moon, watching and waiting long before humans arrived. Jennifer's analysis identified another detail that the original footage's resolution had obscured: the absence of any visible breathing apparatus. No tanks, no regulators, no pressure seals at neck or wrists, none of the equipment that kept human astronauts alive in an environment that wanted to kill them. Either the figure possessed environmental protection so advanced it was essentially invisible to optical observation, nanotechnology, or energy fields beyond current human capability, or its physiology simply didn't require protection, had adapted to or originated in vacuum conditions, making the Moon not a hostile environment, but a habitat. The Artemis 3 mission had deployed an autonomous rover to collect regolith samples from the crater floor, and 6 hours after Tyler's sighting, after the cameras had failed and the crew had been ordered into communications blackout, that rover completed its programmed sampling routine in an area roughly 400 meters from where the figure had been observed. The samples were returned to Earth with the crew, subjected to standard geological analysis at NASA's Johnson Space Center, and the results were filed in the mission's scientific database with no particular attention paid to anomalies in isotopic composition because the analyzing technicians weren't looking for anomalies, were expecting lunar regolith to match the composition established by Apollo samples and decades of meteorite studies. But when Jennifer requested access to the raw spectroscopic data through contacts she'd developed during previous NASA collaborations, and when she applied analysis protocols designed to detect non-natural isotope ratios that might indicate industrial processing or nuclear reactions, the results showed something that made her call Robert back to the laboratory for a second consultation at 11:30 at night. The helium-3 to helium-4 ratio in regolith from that specific location diverged from natural solar wind bombardment patterns, showed enrichment that computer models suggested required either localized nuclear fusion reactions or particle beam exposure, neither of which occurred naturally on the Moon, and both of which represented technologies that humanity had developed only in primitive, laboratory-scale demonstrations. Someone or something had been using advanced energy systems in that crater, had left isotopic signatures in the dust, evidence that would remain detectable for thousands of years after the activity ceased, and the implication was unavoidable. The moon wasn't just visited by something unknown, it was being actively utilized, had infrastructure, had operations that required power generation at levels human lunar programs were still decades from achieving. Rachel Ortiz, commander of Artemis III, had maintained the silence her non-disclosure agreement demanded for 22 months after returning from the moon, had appeared at congressional hearings about NASA's budget, had testified about the Artemis program's technical success and the promise of sustained lunar presence, had smiled for cameras and accepted commendations, and never once mentioned what she'd seen through the lunar module's observation window. But in November 2029, speaking at an unsanctioned press conference she organized independently, without NASA approval or legal counsel present, Rachel made a statement that would end her career 8 days later when the agency accepted her forced resignation. The moon is not virgin territory. We did not discover it. We returned to it. And whoever was there first, whoever has been there all along, they have technology we don't understand, purposes we can't determine, and they know exactly who we are, and that we've finally noticed them. Reporters asked for elaboration, for evidence, for specifics, and Rachel's response was delivered with the calm precision of someone who had commanded spacecraft and made life-or-death decisions in environments where mistakes meant death. I saw something that cannot exist by our understanding of physics and biology. It moved with purpose and intelligence. And when NASA offered me early retirement to stop talking about it, I understood that I wasn't the first person they'd made that offer to, and I wouldn't be the last. The pattern goes back decades. And the fact that they're still covering it up means they still don't know how to explain it, which means we're not in control of our own moon, and that terrifies them more than they're willing to admit. NASA's official response was released 9 hours later. Commander Ortiz's statements do not reflect the agency's findings or official position. All Artemis III mission data has been thoroughly analyzed and shows no evidence of anomalous activity beyond expected environmental conditions. Though, but they didn't release the footage. They didn't release Marcus Delacroix's analysis. They didn't address the isotope ratios or the decades of classified reports or the pattern of terminated careers. They simply denied, and the denial's very existence confirmed that Rachel had told the truth, because lies require elaborate explanation, while truth only needs to be stated once. The Artemis program officially continues. NASA's public relations materials still feature renderings of permanent lunar habitats and mining operations and scientific outposts that will establish humanity's first off-world civilization. But the timeline for crewed missions to the lunar South Pole, to Shackleton Crater, and the permanently shadowed regions that were supposed to be the foundation of sustainable presence has been quietly and repeatedly postponed since Tyler Brennan watched. Something impossible walk across frozen regolith in February 2027. The official explanation cites ongoing optimization of environmental control systems, refinement of landing procedures, verification of long-duration life support capabilities, all reasonable engineering concerns that sound credible to anyone unfamiliar with the program's internal dynamics, but sources within Johnson Space Center and Kennedy Space Center, engineers and mission planners who spoke to investigative journalist Marcus Webb under conditions of anonymity, tell a different story. Crews are refusing assignments to polar missions. Experienced astronauts with impeccable records who have spent careers preparing for lunar surface operations are quietly requesting reassignment to orbital missions, or Mars preparation programs, or early retirement. Anything to avoid being sent to the regions where Tyler saw what he saw and where something that shouldn't exist apparently does. The international pattern mirrors NASA's hesitation with precision that suggests coordination, or at least shared knowledge, that transcends the usual competitive dynamics of space exploration. China's National Space Administration announced in 2028 that their crewed lunar landing program would target the Moon's south polar region, specifically the Shackleton crater area rich in water ice deposits, a location that offered the same strategic advantages that had made it NASA's primary objective. 6 months later, with no public explanation, the mission profile was altered to target the North Polar region instead. Peary Crater and its surroundings, equally valuable scientifically, but requiring complete redesign of landing procedures and surface operation plans. Russia's Roscosmos, which had committed to participation in the International Lunar Gateway Station and planned surface missions in partnership with European Space Agency, withdrew from all crewed lunar programs in 2029, citing budget constraints that didn't align with their simultaneously announced funding increases for Mars exploration. The European Space Agency redirected its focus to robotic missions and deep space observation, away from human presence on the Moon. India's space program maintains ambitious lunar goals, but has specified landing sites in equatorial regions, avoiding the poles entirely. The pattern suggests coordinated avoidance, nations that compete for prestige and scientific achievement and resource access suddenly agreeing, without admitting they're agreeing, to stay away from specific lunar territory. And the question becomes what they know that their public statements don't acknowledge, what intelligence has been shared through classified channels, what understanding exists among governments about the Moon's actual status as either occupied territory or monitored space, or something that fits no category human civilization has developed to describe our relationship with celestial bodies. The permanently shadowed regions of the Moon's polar craters, places where sunlight has not touched the surface for billions of years, where temperatures remain stable at -240 degrees Celsius, where cosmic radiation is partially blocked by crater walls, and the absence of solar heating allows volatile compounds to persist indefinitely, represent some of the most stable environments in the inner solar system. If an intelligence, biological or artificial, required a location for long-term observation of Earth, and its emerging technological civilization, required concealment from detection, required environmental stability across geological timescales, those craters would be the logical choice, offering natural protection and strategic positioning just 384,000 kilometers from a planet whose radio signals have been propagating into space for a century and whose nuclear detonations created electromagnetic signatures visible to anyone with appropriate detection equipment anywhere in the solar system. The Fermi paradox, the question of why we haven't detected evidence of extraterrestrial civilizations in a universe that should statistically contain millions of them, assumes we're looking in the right places, assumes that civilizations advanced enough for interstellar travel would make themselves obvious, would build megastructures and broadcast signals and leave evidence we couldn't miss. But what if detection avoidance is the norm? What if civilizations that survive long enough to achieve interstellar capability do so precisely because they've mastered the art of observation without revelation, of studying emerging civilizations without interfering in ways that trigger defensive responses or cultural disruption, waiting and watching to determine whether a species develops the maturity to join whatever community exists beyond our current perception, or whether it destroys itself. Before reaching that threshold, Tyler Brennan, who watched something walk on the Moon and had his career quietly terminated, who signed non-disclosure agreements and accepted early retirement and tried to resume normal life as though he hadn't seen evidence that humanity's understanding of our place in the cosmos was fundamentally incomplete, made one final recorded statement before disappearing from public record in March 2030. The recording was made secretly during a conversation with Marcus Webb. No video, just audio, captured on Webb's phone during a meeting in a parking garage in Houston that Tyler had insisted occur without witnesses or documentation. Tyler's voice on that recording carries the weight of someone who understands they're burning their last bridge to a normal life, but can't remain silent any longer. I saw its eyes, or what appeared to be eyes, when it stopped and oriented toward our position. And there was recognition there, not the blank stare of a camera or sensor, but awareness. It knew we were there. It knew we'd seen it. And the way it turned and walked away, calm, unhurried, like it had made a decision about us, and whatever that decision was, it didn't require immediate action. That's what I can't stop thinking about. Not that something is on the moon. We know that now. But that it looked at us, at humanity in our module with our cameras and our flags and our programs to colonize lunar soil, and it decided we weren't a threat. We weren't important enough to worry about. We were just observed, catalogued, and dismissed. The recording ends with Marcus Webb asking Tyler where he's going, what he plans to do now that he's violated every non-disclosure agreement NASA had required, and Tyler's response is barely audible, spoken quietly as though he's already resigned to whatever consequences will follow. I don't know. Somewhere they won't find me. Somewhere I can try to forget what I saw. But I needed someone to know the truth. Needed it documented. Because they're still up there. They're still watching. And at some point, humanity is going to have to decide whether we keep pretending we're alone, keep sending astronauts to the moon, and acting like it's empty territory, or whether we acknowledge that we're not the only intelligence interested in Earth, and we never were. Tyler Brennan's current location is unknown. NASA declined to comment on his statements. The Artemis program continues with revised timelines and altered mission profiles. And the permanently shadowed craters of the lunar poles remain unexplored by human presence. Dark regions holding secrets that governments appear content to leave undisturbed, at least for now. The question that no official agency will address, the question that Tyler's footage and Marcus's analysis and Rachel's testimony and Kara's interview and 55 years of suppressed reports all point toward, remains unanswered. If something is on the moon, observing Earth, present in our nearest celestial neighbor, then where else are they? What else have they seen? And when they decide we're finally worth direct contact rather than distant observation, will humanity be ready for the answer? To the question we've been asking since we first looked up at the stars and wondered if we were alone. We're not alone. That much is clear. We never were. And whatever shares the moon with us has been patient enough to wait while we grew from primitive tool users to spacefaring civilization. The real question is what happens when their patience ends and they decide it's time for us to know what they've known all along.